Just before we start, I will say a few words about nationalism studies in UCD in Ireland, and then we'll have a lecture, and then I'll respond very briefly, and then we'll have a question and answer session, and after that we'll have a break, I imagine. Yeah. Okay, so when we talk about nationalism in an Irish and UCD context, we can say that this is a topic that has been, in some respect, very prevalent, very dominant for the past 2 centuries. I mean, Irish nationalism has been, very visible, very vibrant, both as a political ideology and as a social movement. And it has, in some respects, we can say, defined the sphere. Often Irish cases taken as an example of a variety of theories, nationalism and Northern Irish, tension, if you like, and the conflict between the two forms of nationalism, the British Unionist one and the kind of Republican version of nationalism is still ongoing, unsolved. And precisely for those reasons, nationalism has been studied in Irish universities, although through a particular lens, if you like. Essentially most of these, particularly early studies, were quite biased, written from a particular version of a Republican perspective, if you like. So this is changing. We can see that among more kind of contemporary historians, we can see that in political science as well, and perhaps more so in sociology. And I think UCD is very a good place for development of nationalism studies, and again to advertise our own school of sociology. We have a number of colleagues who work in this area. You will meet some of them, Irla, Sean, Andreas, and myself, and I think we have a number of PhDs, growing number of PhDs working in this area, from cultural sociology to historical sociology, which incorporate the study of nationalism. We also have a number of master's programs dealing with this topic, again, cultural sociology, crime, violence and conflict, and global migrations and cultural difference. And we teach a number of undergraduate modules as well in this area of nationalism. So in some respect, this conference is really a good sign, that this field, this area will grow, will develop. And in Irish context, again, next year is a centenary of the 1916 Rising. So in a sense, nationalism will be all around us, the commemorations, the images, so lots of material for us to study. So in that respect, I think it's really good to have this conference, and again, to thank the organizers, that we all have the opportunity to share theoretical and conceptual issues, and to look at a variety of cases. As I see from the program, most of our cases are from Europe, not exclusively so, but I think overwhelmingly European cases, so we will probably focus more on Europe than on other parts of the world, but maybe next time we'll have a global conference on nationalism. Okay, so I'll move now just to say a few words about our speaker. Professor Umut Özkırımlı he's a professor of political science at the Middle Eastern Studies, Center for Middle Eastern Studies in University of Lund. He's also an honorary professor in Europe, Nationalism and Globalization at the Center for Modern European Studies, University of Copenhagen. He's also senior fellow at Istanbul Policy Center at Savanatsi University and research associate at LSE. Before he worked for many years in Istanbul, and also was a visiting professor at the University of Malmö, University of Cyprus, and was a senior fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. His research interests, obviously apart from nations and nationalism, include other areas: multiculturalism, identity politics, social movements, and he does both theoretical work and normative political analysis, as well as empirical studies in Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, more recently stuff on social movements, protest movements in Turkey, but also on Rojava cantons in Syria, on Alawites in Syria as well. Among his publications, so he's published obviously a lot of studies. The most well-known is his book Theories of Nationalism, which has been in the 2nd edition, and now he's working on the 3rd edition, so I think today's talk will So that'd be a kind of link with that new third edition of Theories of Nationalism. He's also written a book on, together with Sophos, on Greek and Turkish nationalism, fermented by history, nationalism in Greece and Turkey, which is a very unique book in a sense, written by a Turk and a Greek on Greek and Turkish nationalism, and it's translated in Greek and Turkish. So there must be something wrong with that book. He's also author of the Contemporary Debates of Nationalism and the Making of the Protestant Movement in Turkey. Okay, so Umut, I'll give you a floor now and then.
Thank you, Sinisha. It's Sinisha, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the right. I'm always struggling with the Croatian various accents and letters. But I've known Sinisha for years, and well, I would like to thank, of course, the School of Sociology for inviting me to Dublin. My first time here in Ireland. I've been to Belfast before, but not to Dublin. Particular thanks to Özgecan, who's been arranging everything that relates to this conference, and obviously my friend Sinisha, whom I suspect has a little hand in this invitation, maybe, I don't know. Well, I mean, as he mentioned in the introduction, the timing could not have been better because I just started working on a third edition of Theories of Nationalism. Not that I wanted to be honest, but it's a contractual obligation. I mean, the second edition was a necessity because the first was published in 2000, and then a lot, I'm assuming that you're all familiar with nationalism debates in the academic literature and all of that, so a lot has happened after the first edition, so I had to do second edition in 2010, which I enjoyed doing, and it's still, actually in print, it's still selling quite well, and then I've been approached like 3 years later to do a third edition, and I tried to spend a couple of hours over lunch to tell them that there is no, there isn't enough material to do a third edition. I mean, and I'm not a kind of this typical, prototypical textbook writer who keeps, adding two lines to new, and then go print another third edition or whatever. But then, the answer I got was standard. The American market wants new editions every once in a while. So I decided to engage in a suicidal mission. So I will write a third edition whose main argument is that nationalism studies as such is over. That this debate should be abandoned to make space for more creative and I would say more urgent, more contemporary methods of nationalism. So it's the first, I was in Edinburgh a couple of weeks ago where I presented kind of the similar paper because some of you are actually from Edinburgh. There's a nationalism studies group there too, so I wanted to hear their opinion about these initial ideas, and that's what I'm going to do here too, and I'm looking forward to Sinisha's comments and also your comments, so please be as critical as possible. Don't treat me in a hierarchical way, oh this keynote speaker, blah blah. Just smash the paper into pieces because I will benefit. I'm here to learn as well. As much as possible, and as it's kind of also one of the reasons I accept. Well, I almost, if possible, almost always accept student conference invitations because that's where the real stuff is going on, in my view. I mean, I never go to these mass conferences usually, and also, it was an opportunity for me to start breathing in nationalism again. A smell that I haven't missed that much, to be honest. But well, a few glasses of Guinness more than makes up for it. So I'm happy. So I'm going to talk about, in line with the title of the conference, Nationalism, Past, Present, and Future. I've looked at the program. Some of the papers are conceptual, theoretical, as Sinisha said, but there are some also looking at empirical cases. And in my case, well, it's mostly theoretical, but I'm going to focus on a particular nation, actually, a less known and curiously understudied case study in the field of nationalism studies, namely the imagined community of nationalism scholars. Now, to the best of my knowledge, there are only a handful of scholars who study this peculiar imagined community, and despite their small and dwindling numbers, they are bitterly pitted against each other. And my book, well, I'm making a living out of this fight myself, so I'm guilty as charged. Mea culpa. Most of these scholars who study the imagined community of nationalism scholars claim that this particular nation is the product of mostly the political conditions of the early 20th century, and identify historians such as Carlton Hayes, Hans Kohn as the first nation-building elites, whereas others trace the origins back to the 18th century, to the writings of Enlightenment thinkers such as Canton Rousseau, and later the musings of German Romantics. A small yet very influential and vocal group of scholars who call themselves ethnosymbolists stick to a safer middle-of-the-road approach, stating that although the study of nationalism has become a field in itself in the 20th century, its underlying assumptions, insights, and methodologies can be and should be examined in la longue durée, extending into the medieval period, if not the antiquity. Finally, a devoted group of activists masquerading as scholars, the perennialists, argue that the imagined community of nationalism scholars is as old as nations themselves, hence has existed since time immemorial, though they might not have been called as such, but referred to as the clergy, a term, they would add, that has been wrongly identified with those providing religious services. Now, the imagined community of nationalism scholars, I would say, can best be seen as a diaspora nation. Where is my friend? Yeah, diaspora nation, safely ensconced in several host nations, yet yearning to return to a long-lost homeland, whose exact geographical locations and physical boundaries vary according to each member of the community. So for Anthony Smith, that would be ancient, not current Israel. In current Israel, they consider him anti-Zionist, for some odd reason that I have still not been able to understand. For Gellner, it will be his childhood pre-war Prague, probably, pre-nationalism Prague. And for Benedict Anderson, it is Ireland, of course. Its scattered and heterogeneous nature notwithstanding, this imagined community of nationalism scholars has its own rituals. The annual scholarly conferences, like the convention of the Association for the Study of Nationalities at Columbia University, or the annual conference at the LSE, the ASAN conference at the LSE. But the members of the nation, the imagined nation, get together in smaller congregations such as these on a regular basis to ensure the survival of their community and to restore their belief in the continuing relevance of nations and nationalism and their own self-importance as intellectuals dedicated to its reproduction. They do not have an anthem or a flag yet, but they certainly have national literary canons, most of them published curiously in 1983, so a landmark year for the community itself, and pamphlets such as Nations and Nationalism, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Ethnicities, and you name it, where they periodically produce a scientific discourse which sustains the community and its customs and traditions, by which I mean, the regular meetings, the scholarly publications, endless debates and polemics on the origins of nations and nations. Now, in this particular sense, the imagined community of nationalism scholars is a quintessential example of what an esteemed member of the community, Eric Hobsbawm, ingeniously called an invented tradition. That is, and you know probably the definition, but anyway, a set of practices normally governed by overtly and tacitly accepted rules of a ritual and symbolic nature, which seek to inculcate certain values and norms of behavior by repetition. Now, if the period from 1870 to 1914 is the apogee of invented traditions when it comes to nations and nationalism proper, the same can be said of the period between 1980 and 2000 for the field of nationalism studies. The incursion of legions of previously uninterested graduate students into the field provided a unique opportunity to the field's senior gatekeepers, the equivalent of nation-building elites, who seized the moment to extend and consolidate their authority over the definition of the community and the bounds of the debate. And the invention of the theoretical debate on nationalism, of which, you know, I keep writing for some reason, was the main strategy adopted by the ruling elites to counter the threat posed by other academic fads like Islam, globalization, and to prevent the dissolution of the community. The debate revolves around the question, when is the nation? But it contains much that is factitious, hence would qualify as the second process of invention identified by Hobsbawm, namely the deliberate invention of new traditions for quite novel present purposes, in this case the perpetuation of precarious careers. I'm assuming, of course, now that as current or would-be members of the imagined community of nationalism scholars, you will have gone through the compulsory mass schooling, hence well versed in the basics of the debate between perennialists, ethnosymbolists, modernists, and what have you. So I'm not going to repeat this here, but I will briefly, as a kind of prelude to the main argument, talk about a recent contribution to this debate by an ambitious newcomer to the community, Gutt. And I think Sinisha has met him in person but never read the book yet, which is very good for him, you know, who seems to be, you know, quite determined to redefine the terms of the debate and question the authority of the senior gatekeepers, not with the intention of deconstructing the debate, by the way, but for the hope of a peaceful takeover. And then, okay, so let's just give you an idea of what the book is about. Declaring at the outset of the book, it's a Cambridge University Press book which is published, I think, 2013 or 14. Nations, the long history and deep roots of political ethnicity and nationalism. He says that this, you know, this book is a result of a deep satisfaction with the study of nations and nationalism as it is currently framed. So he's off to a promising start. So we expect a thorough deconstruction of the current debate, a fresh, if not groundbreaking, historical or theoretical approach based on a critique of existing theories or interpretations of nationalism. But what you find instead is not a refutation of the endless bickering between perennialists and modernists, but a flimsy adaptation of Fukuyama's infamous end of history thesis to nationalism studies. A plea for the merging of perspectives, a glossy one-line invitation which states that we should all become perennialists. Why? One, nationalism, he says, is a particular form of a broader phenomenon, that of political ethnicity, and ethnicity has been highly political ever since the emergence of the state, even before. Fine. Two, nations and national states can be found since the beginning of history, to the extent that pre-modern states exhibited a rough congruence between ethnicity and statehood, not national, ethnicity and statehood, they were by definition national. So the city-states like ancient Greece, you know, ancient Athens, should be regarded as nationhood. They had a strong sense of being a single ethnos, which shared blood ties, language, a pantheon, mythology, traditional texts, and not least the Olympic Games. Evidence, what is the evidence for that? A quote from Herodotus, who talks about, you know, the famous ancient Greek historian, who talks about the kinship of all Greeks in blood and speech, and the likeness of their way of life. The first nation state, ancient Egypt. State, not nation. A unified state with a distinct people of shared ethnicity. Although everything about proto-history, Egyptian included, is partly conjectured, that's what he says, the archaeological findings increasingly tend to confirm the general outline of later Egyptian traditions. Now, how much of an ethnos the inhabitants of the Nile Valley had been before the unification, we don't know, Gutt tells us, and this is the argument, but it stands to reason that they were. So there is no, and this is this quotation, in fact, there is no compelling reason to think that the said population did not constitute an ethnos. Very tightly argued, okay? I'm repeating, there is no compelling reason to think that the ancient Egyptians were not a nation. Now, I think some of you are students, graduate students, postdocs, don't write a master's dissertation like that, okay? I'm not talking about PhD. What about the question raised by several modernist skeptics about the affiliations of the masses? Did the peasants, for example, who constituted the vast majority of the population, share in the elite culture propagated by the state and religious authorities? Gutt admits graciously that it is almost an intractable problem, and he says the sources on the illiterate masses are close to non-existent. And yet the answers to the above questions appear to be affirmative. What is the above question? Whether the ancient Egyptians did share in the elite culture. And again, the argument is, it is widely accepted that state, religion, and civilization in Egypt were inextricably linked. It is widely accepted that. Okay. 3. The most tangible test for the existence of pre-modern national affinities is the resistance shown. This is the semblance of an argument in the face of foreign intrusion. People in pre-modern societies lacked individual freedom, hence the purpose of their struggle and sacrifices against foreign intrusion, foreign rule, could only be collective freedom, that is, national independence. So, never mind the differences between ethnicity and nation, ethnicity and religion, ethnicity and local identities, forget about power relations, coercion, or interests, and instead keep this in mind. It was quite often popular sentiments and passions, rather than the calculations of sometimes collaborative elites, that sparked massive popular rebellions against foreign imperial rule, in actuality national wars of independence. So yes, the argument is imperial wars were wars of national independence. I'm not going to bore you more with the stories of Gutt's other First Nations and his string of highly sophisticated and historically sensitive arguments, this is in quotation marks, nor will I outline the attempt to call sociobiology to his rescue, stating that human cultural forms are built around a clearly recognizable deep core of innate evolution-shaped human propensities, which constitutes the deep roots of patriotism and nationalism. To repeat, and to conclude in this part of the talk, suffice it to say that if this long convoluted text were submitted to me as a graduate student essay, it would fail miserably, let alone published by such a prestigious publisher as Cambridge University Press, which shows, once again by the way, the reach of the tentacles of the imagined community of nationalism scholars, which exhibits a strong sense of solidarity towards its fellow members, even if they are dissenters. So what is the problem with all this? Not simply Azar Gutt's desperate, one might even say tragic, attempt to save the day, but the whole debate itself. Why has so much ink been spilled by generations and after generations of nationalism scholars to locate the very first nation? What makes the question, when is the nation, so important? I mean, even Walker Connor, who the first to pose this question in a conference at the School of Slavonic Studies in London in 1989, finds it difficult to understand. He wrote in 2005, in the book edited by Gordana and Natsuko, that I don't feel that the issue of when is the nation is of key significance, simply because, he says, in an important sense, today's nations defy dating. Identity does not draw its sustenance from facts, but from perceptions. Not from chronological or factual history, but from sentient, felt history. Connor has a point, of course, but it's only part of the story. It is indeed difficult to identify the date of origins of nations, simply because we're talking about processes, historical processes, not specific events. And the answer to the question depends very much on how do you define the nation, who defines the nation. So even the most devoted members of the imagined community of nationalism scholars admit that those who define nations as elite phenomena are able to detect nations in pre-modern eras. That's what Gutt does based on Herodotus' quotations. laying emphasis on a sense of cultural distinctiveness. Whereas those who regard nations as mass phenomena argue that we cannot talk of nations before the modern era until large numbers of people start to make political demands on the basis of this sense of cultural distinctiveness. So cultural distinctiveness obviously is old, or whatever, how do you, old, ancient, whatever. But the point is, what was its political significance? Simple question. Since it is highly unlikely that theorists of nationalism will come up with a universally agreed definition of nations or nationalism, the question of when is the nation is bound to remain unanswered. More importantly, and that's the main argument that I will try to develop in the third edition, let's just assume that even if it were possible, to ascertain the date of origins of nations, how would this contribute to our understanding of nationalism today? What would be the added value of knowing whether ancient Israel, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt is the first nation to addressing some of the challenges posed by nationalism today, such as, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, the rise of radical nationalist right, the failures and promises of multiculturalism, the formation of new nations, or the breakup of existing ones, the questions of nations without states, transnationalism, which includes, a range of phenomena, social movements that transcend national boundaries, such as, jihadism at one end, Occupy movements at the complete and the other end of the spectrum, or experiments in supranationalism, first and foremost the EU and its various crises. This is precisely why I call the debate on nationalism an invented tradition to keep an imagined community alive. Take the conventional division used to classify the contemporary theories of nationalism. Both the categories and the labels used to describe each category are highly arbitrary. For one, the fitting of a particular theory into the existing categories depends to a large extent on who is doing the sorting. Take Anthony Smith. He spent his whole life to carve himself a special niche he called ethno-symbolism. He becomes a perennialist, in fact a soft perennialist, according to Gutt, for instance. The classification does not do justice to the nuances of the works of the theorists concerned, hence can be seriously misleading. And it is indicative that few of the theorists concerned accept the labels used to describe their work. And the best example of this, and let me get a little personal here, is none other than myself, the postmodernist. I still don't know who first called me that and why, I still don't know. The problem here, of course, is that very few scholars who uses the term in their descriptions, the postmodernists, define what they mean by postmodernists, and the label is often used in a dismissive way to pour scorn, to belittle approaches that stress the multiple, fluid, and constructed nature of ethnic and national identities, a truism today that most social scientists would readily accept. I'm not going to dwell on this in detail. I think it's to a certain extent irrelevant, but just to set the record straight, the analytical framework I suggested in the second edition of Theories of Nationalism, and that will be really shortened in the third edition because I don't think it is important, to be honest. This framework that I applied to particular cases, namely to the Kurdish, Turkish, Greek, and more recently Swedish nationalisms, is grounded in the study of historical processes. And I do reject positivistic determinism and the possibility of a grand theory, but I do not underestimate, I have underestimated the significance of particular contexts or the value of political, economic, sociocultural factors in understanding a particular nation or a particular nationalism. So the problems with the whole debate on nationalisms become clearer if we probe deeper into the categories themselves and consider the claims that are supposed to help us distinguish between the various categories. To begin with, for instance, what makes this whole category of perennialism or primordialism, whichever you prefer, analytically useful? Some, including Gutt, tells us that perennialism enables us to recognize the emotional appeal and power of nationalism, something that, they argue, the modernists fail to do so. These claims are based on two assumptions, which are both debatable, I would say completely wrong, but let's just be diplomatic here, debatable. One is that the modernists dismiss the power of nationalism, a claim that can be easily falsified by a casual list of quotations from the works of the modernist members of the imagined community, including such radicals as Ernest Gellner, and just ask Sinisha, who has been his student for years. I mean, did Gellner underestimate the power of nationalism? I'm not sure. Of course, he claimed that nationalism is, based on industrial society, new, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, the famous quotation about this, the singing folk songs with the help of a little alcohol and all of that. He was a romantic in certain ways. Maybe he needed a little alcohol to expose this, but come on, I mean. And two, how would knowing, again, I go back to an original question, how would knowing that, say, drawing on the example, that ancient Egypt is the first nation state, help us to understand the emotional appeal of nationalism? Now, if this were a claim about modern Egypt, we might at least take it at its face value and try to expose its weaknesses, okay? The modern Egyptians have a sense of continuity since time, immemorial, so, that the fact that the ancient Egypt had a, statehood or a sense of political ethnicity helps us understand current, modern Egypt today. But it's not. It's a general argument. So, the question is, how would the existence of national sentiments, let's assume that they did exist, in ancient Egypt from around 3000 BC, so 5,000 years ago, explain an ordinary Scots or Irishman, Irish woman's attachment to her nation today? Or the rise of anti-immigrant feeling and their translation into a xenophobic form of nationalism in today's Europe? That the majority of today's populations feel attached to their nation is a platitude. The point is to explain why and how. I mean, we discussed about this, with Sinisha. I mean, that's the primordial argument, that the emotional power of nationalism, this and that. Yes, we know, of course, why would we be studying nationalism if we didn't have something to look at? But the point is, how do you explain that? Why does, for instance, anti-immigration feeling today turn into nationalism and not, say, into left-wing solidarity in progressive movements, for instance? Simple question. I mean, how does that help me? How does perennialism would help me explain this fact? And here, the perennialist members of the imagined community are silent. They do not explain the passions evoked by nations and nationalism. They assume them. Nothing about power, ideology, there's a book about that, processes of socialization, interest calculations, nothing about ruptures, fluctuations over time, or various contingencies, no mention of resistance or subversion. So, nothing about those who do not feel attached to their nation or value other sources of identity more than their ethnic and national affiliations. I'm a good example of that, and I know several people. How would Gutt's deep core of innate evolution-shaped human propensities explain those who risk their lives for transnational causes, such as those who face, who come from different places and gather in various Occupy movements, for instance, facing police brutality, or worse and more acute, those who travel thousands of kilometers to fight for or against jihadism, the Islamic State, which is a, we're not talking about hundreds now, we're talking about thousands of people, if you are, interested in this field. There's no point in spending time, in wasting our time on the two other categories of the debate on nationalism, namely the ethnosymbolists and the modernists. Ethnosymbolism is simply perennialism light, hence does not deserve separate treatment, and this might be in fact the only valid argument Gutt makes is in his 441 pages long book. For Anthony Smith, the most prominent exponent of this approach, the nation is a category of human association that can be found everywhere throughout history. The stress on the importance of myth, symbols, rituals, the hallmark of perennialism light, is simply another platitude which is taken for granted, not accounted for with due attention to processes of continuity and change. In that sense, all the criticisms I raised for perennialism apply to Smith and his cult-like following. And the final category of modernism, of nationalism studies, the modernism, is too heterogeneous to be called a distinct approach, and the differences between the various figures that have been placed under this category cannot be explained away as minor squabbles. But more importantly, those who are called modernists are interested in much more than chronological questions or the genealogy of nations, trying to shed light on various political, economic, and socio-cultural processes which have led to the emergence of the historical formation we call today nations, or the ideology of nationalism. Of course, modernist theories have their own problems too, but one, unlike perennialists who produce pages upon pages based on, pages of narrative based on a few key assumptions and at best flimsy evidence, modernists develop arguments that can be falsified and refuted. I mean, Gellner is the best example of that. I mean, he has, there are, at least 10 books all criticizing Gellner, countless articles criticizing Gellner, and still, the value of his approach is submitted. There are things that you read and learn from Gellner, even if you disagree with his general approach, because he produces arguments. And two, there is no one single claim that would characterize all modernist theories or theorists, including chronological questions. If you look at, the First Nation, Anderson, Latin America, the revolution, post-revolution Latin, and then, if you look at Leah Grenfell, you go back to 16th century England. So, they disagree on the, first of all, they don't say necessarily that it's modern, and secondly, the First Nation or how nation came to emerge, it differs. They have different answers. So, bluntly put, there is no one modernist approach as such. To conclude then, the attempt to sort various theoretical approaches into the airtight categories of the so-called grand debate on nationalism is a trivial pursuit. Or in the words of Walter Connell himself, little more than an exercise in academic name-calling, which is something we like to do because that's how we make our living. And I say we, okay? I'm not taking myself out of this. More importantly, the question upon which the categories or the debate itself, are based is insignificant, even frivolous. As I have, they argued at the outset, the debate on nationalism is an invented tradition dating back to the 1980s, a strategy adopted by the scholarly community's gatekeepers to put order to the rapidly growing field of nationalism studies. Today, it is a dead horse that some members of the community continue to flog, but the clock is ticking. Already, several members of the younger generation of scholars have rejected the founding fathers and their ways. This is an analogy from Keduri, if you're familiar with this book. And this is a quotation from Keduri, and their rejection extended to the very practices, traditions, and beliefs which had over decades fashioned the field we know as nationalism studies. It is now time to move beyond this Anachronous invented tradition and to address the real issues, contemporary issues raised by nations and nationalism. In the meantime, I think you probably are all familiar with this now of, it's not broadcasting anymore, this Hollywood blockbuster Emergency Room, ER. I love those scenes, once in a while, once in every 10 episodes, there is, a case of failed resuscitation. They bring a patient, all the doctors are there, and all, they do everything to resuscitate the patient, and then at the end, they can't do anything. The senior doctor looks at the clock and says, okay, I call it. So I think, in the case of nationalism studies too, the senior doctor in the emergency room will soon put a halt to the efforts of the likes of Azar Gutt, Avial Rochefort, Anthony Smith, who are trying to resuscitate a dead patient, check the clock and make the call. That's the end. So if I were you, I would start preparing for the next wave of nationalism studies and read the third edition of my book as a historical account of a bygone era. Thank you.
Thank you.
Don't buy it, by the way. You know, it's within a couple of months they'll put it in Library Genesis and you can download it for free. I believe in open access.
Thanks very much, Umut. I will be brief so that we have plenty of time for questions and for the attacks that you are expecting from everywhere. Well, just a few points. I mean, obviously, I generally agree with Umut's diagnosis of the field, if you like, and since 1980s there was that kind of general narrowing of debate. I mean, kind of throughout the 90s we had lots of these, you know, the focus was on, you know, Gellner versus Smith, the debating of the nation, but Gellner was never really fully into this debate. He was much more than that. This was a kind of side issue for him in many respects. And if you look at the you know, early scholars of nationalism, Keddery and Kohn and Gellner and many others, they were kind of polymaths. They were really proper intellectuals in a traditional sense, people who did study and were versed in philosophy and sociology, anthropology, in many areas. So and in that respect, if you want to study nationalism, you really need to have this wide net you know, of knowledge. And unfortunately, I think from 80s onwards, these debates have become ossified. You know, there's this whole obsession about you know, how old nations are and how old nationalism is an ideology. So that kind of is problematic in itself. So I share that view. But what is also important for us is to look at the sociological underpinning of this debate. I think, and that's because these debates resonate. There is a reason why Anthony Smith, why Gutt, why Rochwald, and maybe John Hutchinson to some extent are very popular. You know, because they appeal to these nationalist narratives that we are all raised with. In a sense, we come to this world, not to paraphrase Rousseau, you know, with chains, we are chained into nations, in a sense, whether we like it or not. You know, we live in a world of nation states. It's a nation-centric world, and you know, everywhere you go, you know, people will always ask you, you know, first, what's your name, and then where you come from. And it's, you know, if you have a very troubled background, as I do to some extent, it's not easy to explain. So in that sense, you know, we have to kind of look at the sociological reason why some forms of nationalist argument and ethno symbolism is a kind of a sophisticated version of a nationalist answer to this debate, not to mention obviously perennialism and all the kind of other sociological versions of it, because they appeal. You know, we want to have the, you know, whenever you give an interview to a journalist, you know, they want to, you know, they want you to give this kind of a nation-centric answer. If you don't, then you know, you sound subversive, you know, suspicious. You know, who are you? You're an anarchist or whatever. So in that sense, I think there is that reason to maybe focus a little bit on, you know, along the lines of what you suggested, to look at the you know, kind of broader context, you know, how these debates develop, but also, you know, their response, why they are popular in many respects. The second issue is that which you raised, which I also think is a good one. A lot of these debates have focused on, you know, kind of the long durée type analysis, but this is a particular version of the long durée. This is the culturalist or biological long durée. Gutt is biological. Smith is a culturalist version of kind of the ethnic origins of nations. You know, that the culture matters and the context changes, but it's still the culture that dominates. But we have at least two other versions of long durée, which are, you know, worth engaging with, and at least one of them it's worth preserving. So there's the Marxist, you know, Brodel's version, you know, kind of long durée, so the original long durée, if you like, and there is the Weberian long durée, you know, where I find myself fitting to some extent. You know, this is the tradition of Charles Steele, Michael Mann, and Randall Collis's works, and a number of other colleagues. So in a sense, it is important to us. I wouldn't dismiss kind of history. History is important for us to understand where we are. Why nationalism matters today. We have to go back into the past but we don't have to kind of be wedded to these kind of essentially nationalist narratives provided by Smith and Gutt and others in order to understand where we are. So in that sense, past does matter. We cannot dismiss the past. But for me, what matters more is organizational, an element of organizational continuity rather than a cultural one, and obviously the transformations of ideology and all these other things which I deal with in my last book. Okay, so the third point, I think that the whole image about imagined community of scholars and invented traditions it's funny, but it's sad at the same time. I think you're right in some respect. There is that kind of way how intellectuals produce knowledge, and there is an element of, if you like, preserving your own position, and I think that's, Collins has written a really good book, The Sociology of Philosophies, how, Randall Collins, this big book, Sociology of Philosophy, where he looks at these different intellectual networks, how they emerge, why, German classical philosophers say, well, live more or less in the same street or something like that, and the same in China and India and so on. So in a sense, there is that, and LSE is a sort of has been that network for most scholars of nationalism of the past, let's say, 50, 60 years. We'll see what happens now in the future. And in that respect, I think you're right. What is different, though, when comparing it to nationalism, is that I think we might have symbols, we might have, all sorts of other things that you mentioned, but we have no territory. We have no, even with diasporas, they refer to some kind of territory, some kind of homeland. We have no homeland. You could say that the nationalism scholars are really, in many respects, Mannheim was talking about free-floating intellectuals. So we do attach ourselves to others, we think and work along the same lines. But we are more like, we don't live on a particular piece of land. You could say we live on a ship. So we can jump a ship. The university is a ship that you stay and you move on, and and in terms of your theories and so on. And ships can sink as well as. Okay, and the invented tradition, I think, again, you're right about importance and significance of these ideas to other intellectuals. But again, to go back to what I said already, these explanations also matter to others. Why people read Smith and why these books are translated. And I mentioned why Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities sold 400,000 copies in Japan alone. So there must be a reason for this. And Anderson is really an interesting character because in a sense he's nominally modernist, but he appeals to perennialists and others as well, because you can really interpret this in many ways. Okay, the fourth point is the question of evidence, and I here completely agree with you. In a sense, a lot of the kind of sociobiological and primordial type of analysis is built on almost non-existent evidence. And I remember reading Rochwald's book where he makes these sweeping generalizations essentially on the basis of biblical references and a single piece of archaeological research, a coin minted in 130s, Bar Rebellion. And it's all built around that coin. So that doesn't really seem particularly convincing. And we know that, the further you go into the past, there's very little evidence. And, I know also from the study of violence and war, a lot of these sociological arguments are really difficult to sustain. Okay, and I think one of the points that you made about emotions is a good one, because you're completely right in the sense that primordialists emphasize emotions, but they don't study them. You find it over and over. Nationalism has this emotional appeal, and it does. But it's not the only ideology that has that appeal. All ideologies, if they penetrate, certain groups, have some sort of emotional resonance, and they have to. They're also cognitive too. So instead of, let's say, looking at the sociology of emotions, which is a very developed field, and we know about, again, Collins and Turner and many others, there is no, it's just at the level of a statement. So that's worth, kind of and I think it's modernists who study emotions properly.
Yeah.
And the final point that I want to make, I think I agree with, there is a problem with this labeling. Although we do need some kind of labels, we need to kind of differentiate different approaches, and these labels are always provisional, but they do help us organize the knowledge. In some respects, that's what we do as social scientists. We constantly, provide taxonomies of all sorts. And I think some labels might be completely misleading, like the postmodernist one, which is often used as an insulting label. In Canadian constructivism is labeled as postmodernism, unfortunately. I don't know if there is anybody, I've never met anybody who said, I'm a postmodernist. This is almost, they always find other ways to but I wouldn't really reject grand theory completely. I mean, there are other ways of, how you can do grand theory. I think because sociology is about universalist explanations. It's you don't have to be positivist, you don't have to be kind of dogmatic or determinist in your research or in theoretical claims, conceptual analysis. But I think it is important to maintain a degree, why we need comparative analysis, why we need, we want to find something that is, to some extent, there are obviously particularities, there are special contexts, but there are some universal things that we can say about human beings, and particularly how social orders operate. So I would maintain a degree of universalism there, a little bit more reflexive universalism and softer than what we had before and what's offered by, let's say, positivists, but I wouldn't give up grand theory. Okay, thank you. So that's, now we'll have plenty of time for questions and debate. Okay, so let's start with Andreas then.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a tension between sociology and history, and the question is how to make use of that productively. I've always been convinced that sociology and the social sciences in particular lean towards conceptual imperialism and don't use that very productively, while in history we find very attractive programs that I think we can make use of. So just to give you 3 examples of how to work differently and not reproject something into history, 3 paradigms that come to mind immediately. Intellectual history, Cambridge style, Skinner, Pocock have made really great advances in that field. I think we could make much more use of that. In Germany, it's the Koselleck school, Bielefeld school that has tried to do that. And then maybe last but not least, there's this new global history paradigm emerging. Some of it is nonsense and just collection of facts, but some of it is also quite good. I mean, Osterhammer's transformation of the world, short history of history of the 19th century that just came out, is probably a pretty good example of how to make use of that tension between, not to fall into that kind of conceptual imperialism. But I wish, that there's no discussion with sociologists whatsoever, it seems. There are 1 or 2 names I could come up with who try to engage in the debate, but the rest is just desert. So welcome your talk to point us into the right direction, although I would think that history there's still a lot to do, and to bridge that, or to make that tension, to put that to productive use is still a task to do.
I would actually, I normally prefer to take a number of questions, but this, I would like to, that's the thing. I mean, I wouldn't want to be misunderstood, obviously, and that's, I assume that Sinisha knows about this anyway. Of course history is important. The problem is they don't do history. That's exactly the problem. I mean, I have no, John Bruley is, for instance, why do we like his work? Because he's trying to think that, historically about. Have you seen also his recent collection, Oxford History, Handbook of Global, Oxford Handbook of History of Nations and Nationalism. It has a number of good essays which try to come up, and he's working actually on a global history of nationalism in the kind, I wouldn't be able to pronounce the name, Osterham's tradition, and since he's a German, specialist, he follows Koselleck, he follows all this. I mean, there is a tradition, and then all these names that Sinisa mentioned, Tilly, Mann. I mean, these are not, that's the problem that I have with the debate, and that's what we were discussing with Craig Calhoun at some point. The way in which the term nationalism studies is framed by certain scholars, the ones that I criticize, basically, it's just things that you can do nationalism by just focusing on a number of key questions irrespective of what's going on in other disciplines, in history and all of that. You know, all these good books on nationalism, works on nationalism come from generalists, not the past, but you know, recently, Michael Mann, Charles Tilly, Andreas Wimmer, you know, like, even when he uses quantitative methods, he looks throughout history. It starts, you know, with the, you know, pre-modern period, and then comes to the, so I mean, this is the thing. I mean, of course, we can't do nationalism without studying history. But the problem is, and that's, you know, this cut and paste approach to history. You just find something there and then put it on you know, just as an example to prove your point, basically. You never consider other examples. I mean, it strikes me, and then I will, you know, there will be a section on this. At Princeton, a medieval historian, Patrick Geary, published a book on in 2002 about the invention of this whole, you know, of no one. I mean, he demolished all this medieval history crap, I would say, to be honest. It's been 13 years since the publication of this book. None of the ethnosymbolists, perennialists, Gutt, Rochefort, none of them even mentioned the book in their references. And I mean, we're not talking about, you know, a nameless, whatever, I mean, he's a well-known, established Princeton medieval historian.
There's another book that he's written also before Germany in England, really good, you know, in a similar way.
Exactly. I mean, and then of course all these books by Shlomo Sand. He's been under attack politically for being anti-Zionist conspiracy of the whatever. Blah, blah. I mean, you know, it just.
Although his books are bestsellers in Israel too.
Of course, because there's a very strong, you know, the Haaretz left-wing tradition. So yeah, I mean, just to say that I completely agree with you and Sinisha. Of course, history matters. It's just that this is not history. That's the problem. Not that what they're doing.
Yeah, if I can ask a question, I was really pleased with your presentation and your lecture. It was very interesting, and I wasn't aware of Hasan Gutt's latest book, and it's quite fascinating. I thought the last in that series of your patients, if I may use your metaphor, was Anthony Smith in 2010, where he talks about I don't know, the Egyptian nation being, and also like he's on the same kind of line. You know, maybe not as extreme as Hasan Gutt, but what I'm wondering is how publishers such as Cambridge University Press publish these sort of things, and why there is such a large degree of banalization of theories of nationalism. When you look at, for example, you read a lot of articles that people write on some other subjects, and then if someone is using a theory of nationalism, often it will be Anthony Smith. So this obviously doesn't happen in many other fields. If you look at, I don't know, a field of, like, I don't know, democracy, democratization studies, or any kind of thing, you know, that might be related. People don't do that. Well, why is the banalization of, if you wish, of theories of nationalism so prevalent? I mean, Sinisha mentioned something in his talk as well. But,
yeah.
Oh, hi. Great speech. I was wondering where you would...
Could you please, you know, I mean, I know Dushan, was it?
No, they are.
Yeah. I know him from Florence, when I was in, but you can just say your name and where you come from?
Tamara Trust. I'm at the University of Ljubljana. Of Ljubljana.
Ljubljana, okay. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering where you would put in the everyday identity, everyday nationalism of John Fox and so on, because I was at a very interesting speech where they actually presented the kind of new wave where they said we don't care about any of these debates, we're just studying what's going on the ground. And Anthony Smith was actually there as a response, and he basically just kind of put them into that's kind of a version of ethnosymbolism, but I mean, he really blew off the whole, that part of it. And now it's actually risky to frame your research, to frame your study as an everyday nationalism perspective if you want to submit to, let's say, nation as a nationalism, which is still held by LSE. So where do you feel this particular strand?
But John was at the LSE recently, right?
Yeah.
So you were there.
Yeah.
And Anthony was there.
Yeah.
Yeah. John was very respectful then, because he wouldn't let himself to be. Yeah. normal.
So
But
I'm just wondering, where do you think this
Yeah.
fits in this?
well, I think there are two questions that I need to, because, why does CUP publishes this? It will be speculative. I have an answer, but it's conspiratory. And to be honest, I would say that I hate conspiracy theories, but on the other hand, in recent years, spending more time working and following Turkish politics, I started to somewhat get the feel that, some of the conspiracies that we thought were conspiracies, because they are exposed afterwards, and then you say, well, 2 years ago I thought this would be an huge conspiracy theory, but then all of a sudden, it's just it comes to be true. So I'm a CUP. I know a little bit of the history of the book, and I cannot, it's kind of personal, confidential information, and I know that some people have refused to review the book or actually argued against its publication. But then there are always people that you can, if you send us our Gutt's book to Anthony Smith and Abiel Rochefort as readers, what do you end up? I'm not saying, I'm not accusing people here, because we all have our preferences. Of course I would be much more...
We are filming this, just the way.
Yeah, I know. I'm not known to be a completely politically correct or diplomatic person anyway. But that's the point. It's how do you, and this is, we do have our own preferences as well, but having it look, I'm just giving it as an example. I went through, I published on nationalism mostly with Palgrave. I didn't do books on Turkey with them, and then for some odd reason, I received manuscripts to read on. And I know some of these people. Personally, they're my friends. I read the manuscript, which is, ideologically looks at the world from where I look. But then, the book is full of problems, let's just put it this time diplomatically. So how do you do this? When I was meeting with my publishers, I told them to be more careful, because the system structurally is flawed. You send the book manuscript to 2-3 people, or the articles, okay? If you happen to be, go to the right people, then you're lucky. And it doesn't mean, it's not only ideological reasons and all of that. People don't have time to review stuff.
Do you think there are commercial reasons, like economic reasons?
Of course, and that's the second part. These books sell, as Sinisha put it. This book is a heavenly gift to a Zionist, for instance, or anyone who believes in ancient Greece and all of that, because it, under the cloak of scientific discourses, complicated theories and all of that, it produces, a good, just something to use. The example that I gave, one of the things that led me to talk to Palgrave was a book on Kurdish nationalism by a well-known Turkish political scientist, but complete Kemalist secularist. The book was a scientifically worded denial of the existence of the Kurds. Okay? And that book was used by the General Chief of Staff in a speech just right after the memorandum in 1997 to say that this was a conspiratorial attempt, by the EU and all of that, to divide and to, target Turkey's territorial integrity and all of that. So these books have their bias. That's the problem, and I think it's a close circle. That's why I use it's because it's also entertaining and all, but it's not only for entertainment purposes that I chose this analogy of the imagined community of nationalism scholars. I know pretty much everybody personally, Sinisa does too, who formed this 200-300 people. Apart from the newcomers, the young people who are coming, I know everybody pretty much, and we are the same people. We read these books, we review those articles. So what do you do? Why do I put this? This is one of the things that the everyday identity. And even in the second edition, I presented this as pretty much the only. New kind of theoretical approach that warrants, that deserves some attention. I think it's crucial. It's not part of this. I mean, there are problems with their approach to, you know, that I mentioned in the book. I told them too, you know, and they accepted, Regis and John. But I think this is not your question, so we can talk about it in the coffee break if you want. But it's not part of this. I mean, they're not modernists, they're nothing, you know, they're even critical of constructivism. And I think the approach they suggest, even though when they write, then they abstract from it and they try to write, you know, a kind of a theoretical approach about that becomes problematic because, you know, when you try to operationalize your variables, you're bound to talk about Hungarians, Romanians, and all of that. You can't just write a book with quotation marks, which a problem we had when we were writing the Turkey-Greece books, because, you know, the argument is that before the 19th century there were no Turks or Greeks in the sense in which we would understand the term, but how do you write the whole book then? So the Turks and Greeks in quotation marks all the time, or, you know, the population which has been called to be Turks or perceived to be Turks, or some of which perceive themselves to be Turks. You know, you're not going to be able to do that. I mean, that's something else. But they are not there. And if Smith, Anthony tried to kind of attack him, I mean, I know John. You know, I know how capable a speaker he is. But right now, I mean, people are kind of, you know, trying to be respectful to Anthony. I do too. I mean, he's done a lot for this debate, but I mean, you know, I'm pretty sure that he didn't talk much just because, you know, out of respect. He could have easily countered that. I mean, because that particular approach cannot be criticized from an ethno-symbolist perspective. It can be criticized on several other grounds, but, you know, that everyday identity is one of the, I think, the future of one of the future, you know, topics which will get attention and more. It's very crucial. And I'm reading, you know, now thesis, articles on several things. I just, you know, told me that, you know, forgot your name, sorry, but, you know, on tourism, but also other things, national celebrations, anthems, you know, that there are a lot you can do on these things. And it's not only nationalism studies. I mean, Asaf Bayat has a great book called Life as Politics and talks about the role of religion as an everyday item in the Middle East, with a particular focus on Egypt. So, yeah, that's a very fruitful arena.
I think, so Dave, I'm a part-time PhD student in School of Sociology. Just something just to clarify here, you asked there, you know, how and who defines the nation, and also the emotional attachment to nationalism, and basically this imagined community. Just going forward, say in the Irish context, the demographics are changing rapidly. The imagined community, is it something that's drifting because, say, nearly 12% of the population are now, the census, ethnic minority. So, who defines this? How will this, the nation-state nationalism thinking, will it actually evaporate a little bit as time goes on due to the changing demographics alone and this imagined community? What do people imagine in the future?
Yeah, but that's exactly my point. I mean, even if that's why I said there won't be a universal accepted definition of the nation, simply because, I mean, okay, you might have a conceptual definition of the nation, but then in reality, even the nation itself will keep changing, especially now that, I don't want to use, you know, buzzwords like globalization and all of that, but I mean, you know, with violence, with war, with so many refugees. I mean, 2 years ago, there were what, maybe 100,000 Syrians in Turkey. Right now there are 2 million Syrians in Turkey. Some of them are given citizenship and they vote in the elections. So I mean, how do you define Turkishness, for instance, or the Turkish nation today? How about, you know, I mean, the problems that Ireland, I don't know to what extent it was a serious situation here, but in Belfast, you know, when I was there a couple of years ago, the main problem was the Romani migrants and the violence against Romani migrants, for instance, in a society which has been oppressed for so many years by the imperial powers. And then, so I mean, you know, everything is changing. That's why now we were talking about, you know, anti-immigration feelings and all of that. So these are the questions that maybe we should be looking at. I mean, what you're asking me as a question, as a clarification, is a perfect, for instance, article you know, the research question for an article.
I'm sorry, Chris, but the anti-immigration feeling, would that not reduce the change in demographics in countries? The anti-immigrant stance should not be becoming greater because of the population here, for example, intermarriage, second generation. The anti-immigrant feeling won't be as strong. The amount of people getting citizenship, is that not reducing the impact of anti-immigrant feeling?
No, it's not.
I think so.
No, I don't think so either. But I mean, because you know, it's just scapegoating and all of that. And then, you know, I mean, for instance, you know, this is, I will have a new chapter in the book, in the 3rd edition about, you know, called Nationalism, Theory and Practice. And there I will try to, you know, a few things that I listed here as some of the questions that we could be looking at. And again, I repeat, this is not an exhaustive list. You know, I will try to go through it myself. And I said, okay, this is primordialism, this is ethnosymbolism, this is modernism. What would they have said, you know, to explain, for instance, the rise of anti-immigration feeling? Now, one of the answers that Anthony, for instance, would give, I'm pretty sure, is that, see, that shows the power of nationalist feelings, because when there is a crisis, people go back on, you know, on nationalist, you know, the national identity, you know, the myths and traditions. They say that the immigrants are strangers, aliens, which will pollute this pristine national culture, blah, blah, blah. That will be Anthony's answer, and I think it's bullshit. I would have said that it's because, you know, I would say, for instance, the modernist instrumentalist point of view, which is problematic in so many other respects, but in this particular case it would work better because it's the politicians who work the anti-immigration. They ride the wave of anti-immigration feeling. I mean, it's not necessarily, I mean, you know, the multiculturalism has gone back. Well, it's not. That's the problem. I mean, if you are familiar with the literature on multiculturalism, there was a wave of studies at some point which said that the multiculturalism has failed. And it got a great boost by politicians such as Merkel and Cameron, who said that, yeah, multiculturalism is dead. But then, you know, other people like Kimlicka and others have looked at particular multiculturalist policies that have been implemented by those states that are still in place, intact. So what is it, apart from discourse and rhetoric, that has disappeared? Britain is still multiculturalist, Canada is still multiculturalist, Sweden is still multiculturalist. It's just that there's a discourse that multiculturalism is dead. So does that prove the power of nationalist feelings or racism, or does that prove that, you know, these let's just say, discontent with economic crisis and all of these things are channeled by politicians or by, you know, opinion leaders to a certain channel? Because we know that the answer is not only nationalism. Some turn to religion. Some turn to other kinds of identities. Some become, you know, some become anarchists or anti-neoliberal, you know, anti-globalization movements and all of that. So it's not that simple. I mean, and it's, you know, we need to ask these questions and try to find them. If Anthony is right at the end of the day, I want to see how. Because he may be right. I mean, it may be that we all turn to nationalism, or most people turn to nationalism. Then I want to see why. I mean, it's just, apart from the simple statement that nationalism is powerful. Yeah, come on, of course. I mean, that's what's initial. We're born and raised in a world of nation states. We go through schooling, okay? Mass schooling. We all grew up with certain myths and traditions. I mean, until high school, I learned that Turks came from Central Asia. And the first time I had the chance to question this was when I was doing my master's studies and heard something as invented tradition from Fred Halliday and Anthony Smith. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, so we are receptive to these ideas. And not everybody has the chance to go through, I don't know, this, whatever, enlightenment or questioning of their own personality and the idea of belonging and everything. Yeah, we have complex histories. Not everybody does.
Just to support what you were saying there, about the question about anti-immigration, and you're saying about politicians kind of riding the wave of that and increasing. I was looking at the International Social Survey Program questionnaire survey on national identity. In 1995, which was before the economic boom here, before the increase in the number of immigrants. 2003, when you had the increase in immigrants, you had the economic boom, and then 2013, after the economic boom, still, I think it's actually more like 15% of the population here are not born in Ireland, or various other categories. So what I found was from 95 to 2003, there was a huge increase in anti-immigrant attitudes. But when you put that in an international context, Ireland became like a country like Canada. So the arrival of immigrants, you had some anti-immigrant attitudes. Before that, there really weren't that many immigrants in Ireland, so people just didn't think about it. But then when you hit the time of recession, so from 2003 then to 2013, you'd expect maybe more anti-immigrant attitudes, but it wasn't the case. So you didn't have politicians riding the wave or anti-immigrant, there's none of that political side of things. But then amongst the people surveyed, so we're talking about more than 1,000 people in the survey, the anti-immigrant attitudes dropped a little bit. So becoming a little bit more positive towards immigrants in that period of time. Doesn't mean that there weren't racist attacks being reported.
No,
on
but
a regular,
of course there will be.
That kind of general attitude in society, it didn't change very much. It became a little bit more positive.
No,
so
but I
that
mean,
supports what you're saying.
that's exactly my point. I mean, Sweden is one of the largest immigration receivers, okay? And until recently, they had a moderate right-wing government in power, okay? I mean, in Sweden, right and left is completely, it's a complicated matter because they're all social democrats. But the point is, I mean, the right-wing leader in his election campaign, not the Social Democratic Party who won eventually the elections, Fredrik Reinfeldt went on a campaign and said, prepared for more immigration. There's war in Iraq and Syria. We will get at least 2 million more immigrants in the next 4 to 5 years. He based his campaign on this. I mean, he lost, but not because of this, because he was making other promises that were, and people got sick of them. But that's the point. I mean, so.
But what do you mean by immigrants? I mean, look, I don't know. I mean, it's a little bit wobbly here, the concept, right? I mean, does European immigration count? Of course, we have, almost 300,000 Poles living in this country, another couple of thousand, almost making up 500,000. It's a considerable size of the population who do not count as immigrants, right? Because they come from within the EU. Nor do we count immigrants from Ireland who are going to other places in the EU. So what are we talking about? Then Sweden had the same prohibition as while Ireland and the UK welcomed after the opening of the wall, welcomed immigration. So lots of people came. So what are we talking about here?
Yeah, but that's exactly my point. I mean, but then if you continue this line of argument, then the whole question of anti-immigration feeling leading to nationalism also becomes redundant. Because what is immigration? Who is an immigrant? And then why would this lead necessarily to a more parochial, exclusive, whatever understanding of national identity, say in Ireland, UK, or Sweden, or wherever? I mean, it's a lot about other things.
Thank you very much. I'm a student from classics, and I'm studying perennialism and Greek identity in 4th century BC. So it's about Socrates is a contemporary of Socrates. He's like in his speech launched a campaign against Persia. So I use a lot of materials from Herodotus. So Herodotus, I can assure that in classics we abandon the nation or state in our study because ancient Greece has never been a nation, and it's not a state. We call it polis. So and polis is kind of used by Athenians. Because other states may be called ethnics, so it's called ethnos, equal ethnic ethnicities. So, because I'm from China, and you mentioned some.
You're from?
China.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you mentioned some books like Anthony Smith and like another imaginary community. This is very popular books in China. So it's a lot of translations and different versions and republished. It's kind of, if all these kind of ideas or things, like elite thought and this is, I mean, I read all these books, but they are not really talking about China. No, I mean, and then these books introduced into China and translated into Chinese and very influential among scholars, students, and I have found book list recommended these books as, I mean, for students to study sociology, anthropology, they need to read all these books. So, I mean, how to evaluate this kind of influence? I mean, this kind of scholar, they didn't talk about China, but they introduced into another country and have influence them, like students like me, when I was in my undergraduate and my master. I'm from a university, it's a special university for minority groups in China. So we read these books and our research is grew from these books. So how to evaluate this influence to another country or to another generation?
Well, it's, I mean, Sinisha gave the answer first. I mean, well, a number of answers, of course, are possible. I mean, one is this is how the debate is framed. I mean, I was a master's student in 1994, and I read these things, and then because I suffered as a student, because I couldn't find a kind of a general introduction to all these theories and all of that, I wrote this as my PhD. Actually, I wrote this in Turkish and then translated it into English. So I mean, this is the debate, and then people, keep asking me, but I do, openly acknowledge this. I mean, why do you adopt those categories if you don't believe in them? Well, because this is how the debate is conducted. That doesn't mean that I have problems with it. So I mean, that's why I'm calling it. Imagine it as a historical debate. I mean, today we talk about, if you're a political scientist, from modernization theory, from functionalism in sociology. They have pretty much disappeared as valid. But I mean, if you're going to study sociology as a student, you have to start by reading not only Weber and Marx, but Talcott Parsons, because this was important. Or the modernization theory of Barrington Moore and Huntington's earlier books, Seymour, Martin Lipset, if you're a political scientist. I mean, if you want to come to today, you need to study this evolution. That's also a historical approach to the study of a particular topic. I mean, one of the problems we experience, and that's, I saw this in Sweden a lot actually, the center that I'm based, and mostly, in Scandinavian countries, the study of Islam starts with Edward Said, Orientalism and all of that. It's wrong. I mean, Orientalism is a very important book, and I pretty much fully subscribe, I mean, of course, with its flaws, I pretty much, fully subscribe to the main tenets, arguments of this. But I can't, tell my students and MA students that the study of Islam starts with Edward Said. I mean, you had Bernard Lewis, you had the Orientalists. I mean, first read the Orientalists and then read Said and decide whether you agree or disagree with them. So this is why, I mean, I think these are not unimportant topics. And actually, to be honest, I don't know whether Sinisha will agree with me, the best book Anthony has written is his PhD dissertation, 1971. Theories of, I think it's called Theories of Nationalism or something like that. I mean, where he provides a critique of existing, at that time, modernization theories and all of that. No mention of ethno-symbolism, nothing like that. He just provides a very good critique of classical theories and all of that, and comes to basically, and then he started to develop his own views, and that's, I think that was Gellner's damaging influence on him. But that's the thing, you're reading these things because that's part of the history of the study of a particular topic. One. Two, Sinisha's answer. We are, we have our own cultural biases, preferences, and if you happen to be slightly nationalist, or let's just say you like your own culture, which is normal, you know, which is obviously, you know, something. I mean, I live in Sweden. I have a son who is half Swedish and half Turkish, and I speak Turkish to him. Why? I mean, yeah, I'm not a nationalist. I just want him to know that language so that he is in touch with a particular cultural heritage he might or might not choose when he grows up. It's his problem. I don't know. But I mean, I still try to pass it on to him. So let's just say that I'm more than that. I would love to read Anthony Smith because he caters to my needs, you know. It's just, oh yeah, see, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not a nationalist, but I like this particular tradition of this and that and all of. So I mean, how do you name this? How do you make sense of these things? When you're a student, you miss your own, of course, home country. I was dying for the Bosphorus and for rakı, drinking some alcohol and all of these things. Now, does that make me a nationalist? No. But I mean, if you read Anthony Smith, you're very easily swayed by it. The question of why Anderson is read and translated so much was precisely because it's a good book and it's not only about nationalism. And it's not about the catchy phrases of the introduction, imagined communities and all of that. The second additional chapters on the clock, the calendar, are beautiful things that you could use in anything. And that's why that book has become a big hit in literary studies, in anthropology, in, I don't know, in a lot of things. It's not about, actually, if you think of it, it's not only about nationalism. That book is a joy in reading. It has literary taste in it. So, I mean, that's why some of these things go a lot of, you know, I mean, that's why Gellner is read. I mean, this passage about Ruritania and megalomania, or the analogy of Modigliani and Kokoschka. I mean, there's a reason why those books sell. Not only, you know, to dismiss nationalism or to like nationalism, to understand nationalism. There's a lot of things. No matter how much you disagree with Gellner, you go back to the analogy of Modigliani and Kokoschka. Whatever you write on, because it's you know, it's the best way of putting it.
Okay, thanks very much. We'll have to stop here now. We've passed our time, and we'll have coffee, and obviously we can continue with informal discussion.
Just as a note, I won't be here in the afternoon, so if you want to talk to me, please come and, you know, fetch me.
Thanks very much.